eBay Motors and ADVRider.com welcome you to episode 65 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. This week, I speak to industrial designer Hugo Eccles, who does just about anything you need him to do. He teaches, he works with major OEMs, and then he heads out to the shed and builds his own customs under the Entitled Moto moniker. Our conversation covers design, of course, but also over-design, and we get into the electric motorcycle and its peculiar design language. And then we wrap it up with some bad habits of manufacturers. But before we take the leap, a word from our sponsor. Picture this, you're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. Well, it's okay because, whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got everything, brake rotors, lights, and tire exhaust systems, whatever you need. And it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay. Things people love. You buy a new car and then 3 weeks in, you think, well, that doesn't make any sense because you can't reach the back adjustment for the seat because you're always whacking the lumbar adjustment or something like that.
Yeah.
No. Why is that? I mean, you've worked in design long enough, and I'm now going to make you speak for all designers.
Okay. Yes, but, I'll get my hat.
Stuff is obviously tested. Nothing comes out just without people having used it, and I don't know what the rigmarole is for a car, but how does bad stuff make it through the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. Some of it is sort of designed by committee, and everyone's idea has to be in there, and it doesn't really work like that. I don't think the kind of craft or the kind of act of design is necessarily particularly democratic. I mean, I think the end result is democratic. That's the kind of point of it. But no, I think you need a point of view, and you need a design director. You need someone who kind of makes the decisions and makes all the parts kind of pull together, and makes all the different elements pull in the same direction. And work together. I've been a design director for decades, and I sometimes use the analogy like my job as a design director is to kind of thread all the parts together and then pull that thread straight. And you need that sort of overview. I think the other thing is, I'm not entirely sure a lot of stuff does get tested. I think product development cycles have got a lot quicker. I suspect in some cases they've sort of drifted from speed into haste. And I think some stuff gets missed. You can definitely tell products that have been prototyped and iterated over a series of cycles. They've got a different quality to them, I think.
Is it true that I think of when Tamburini did the 916 for the Castigliones when they owned the Ducati, and it was 5 years in the making, and then he had versions, and then he tore it up and started again, and he had another version, and it just sort of went on and on and on. If he wasn't feeling it, he would start again. Now, I remember talking to Adrian Morton, who was the lead designer for MV Agusta, the Englishman. And he just shook his head at the amount of stuff that he had to get through in such a short amount of time. And we were looking at one of his MVs, and I thought it was lovely, and I thought the details were beautiful. And when he looked at it, all he saw was everything that he didn't like.
All he saw was the compromises. Yeah.
Yeah, and I said, care to share a few? And he just glared at me, gave me a death glare. I'm like, are you stupid?
I mean, that's one of the perils of sort of being a designer, is it just completely ruins any sort of layman's joy in things. You could just sit, you're kind of like, okay, that's not a good decision. That was, it's, I think especially nowadays, there's so much. I think in a way we have so many tools and there's so many opportunities that actually in a way that's sort of it's a bit of a trap. I think, I think the 916 was obviously designed with CAD as well, but probably I would hazard a guess much more hands-on as well. I think, and CAD is a very powerful tool, but it gets used for a lot of things it's not very good at, I think. I mean, one thing that I often say, and I also teach industrial design. I'm a professor of industrial design here in California. So I often tell my students, and it's quite provocative, I think, sometimes, that CAD is a very unreliable representation of reality. It's terrible, actually. There's so many occasions where you build stuff on the screen and you think, oh, this is going to be awesome. And then you prototype it and you're like, what was I thinking? And vice versa. There's stuff that you prototype physically and works great in reality. And then when you model it, it looks really weird on screen. But you have to default to reality, because reality is reality, right? So,
and I presume that what you're referring to is the fact that you're taking something that's in, a theoretical 3 dimension on a screen, and you're actually and then you make it in volume, and it's totally different.
It's definitely got a lot better. I mean, there's virtual reality tools and stuff, so you can sort of walk around models and stuff. But I don't think it's still not really a very good compensation for like just building the thing in reality and standing around it. Because I think like the human eye is quite weird. I think close up, it's quite fisheye. It tends to distort a lot of stuff, and further out, obviously, less so. I think that's so. I think the the lens changes, and I don't think a computer can do that very well. There's something about it. You just get these very strange situations. I mean, there's a classic situation in industrial design, or where if you build a perfectly flat surface, to the human eye, it will look concave. So to make something look flat, you actually have to make it very slightly convex. Otherwise, it does this thing called oil canning. It kind of it looks like it's sucked in, although technically it's not. And then you also get some of these situations where like things are geometrically lined up, but when you see them in reality, they don't appear aligned to the human eye. And so there's something really interesting where sometimes to make things right, you have to kind of build them wrong.
Interesting.
And I think it's fascinating. Obviously, CAD is a very powerful tool, and it is hugely useful, and it probably saves as much time as it squanders. But I don't think.
But sorry, can you? Is it too easy to make changes in CAD? Because often I'll look at a motorcycle and well, let's choose any KTM, and it just seems that every surface has every angle, and it looks like it'll draw blood if I get close to it, and I think, and again, I'm merely speculating because I don't do what you do, but I think, well, if that was made in clay, I don't think that would be that way, because that would be physically too hard to make out of clay.
No, I agree. Yes, I agree. I was just looking. I was at a car event last weekend, and there was, I think, a modernish BMW M3 or something, and the faceted surfaces had facets on them, and it was kind of like, and I had the same thought. I thought, if you were building that in clay, you probably just wouldn't build that, because it's just such a pain in the ass to build. You wouldn't do that. I do think also there's this sort of, the trouble with CAD, and I think the designers in the audience would appreciate this or recognize this. Very often you lose all sense of scale, and so you end up what's sometimes known as sort of pixel fucking, like where you're agonizing over fractions of a millimeter that will disappear in finish or disappear in paint, and then when you print the thing out or whatever, and you have a look at it, you're just like, oh my God. I've definitely had that thing where we've like agonized. I mean, maybe for a week over some detail. And then when the part came in, I was like, oh no, that doesn't work, and just filed it off. No, that's just weird and fiddly. Oof, gone, So that's quite easy as well. Yes, I think it's a strange beast, because it's quite easy to change things, but also it has to because it's so infinitely accurate, it's difficult to do gestural stuff, because you can't just sort of do a line. I was having a conversation with another vehicle design friend of mine about, there's that argument that, like, you take any modern car and there's a better version pre 1975, right? Right, and I think there's something about that clay and making lines and stuff like that. And what we were talking about was, I think, when you create something physical, you can, like, run your hand over it, like over the kind of, like, the wheel arches of a car and whatever. And physically you can kind of go, oh, that transition's a bit fast, or a bit slow, and you can feel it. It's kind of an acceleration, deceleration thing. And I think we recognize that visually, maybe not necessarily consciously. I think designers do, because we kind of, we're trained to look for those things. But I think even the general public, they sort of innately and maybe subconsciously recognize when those things are right and when they're not right. And so I think you can do all these, splines and stuff in CAD, and you can sort of judge the transitions of curves and stuff. But I do think there's something about physically running your hand over surfaces where it's a kind of acceleration, deceleration thing. It's quite kind of visceral. And I think you pick up on that. I really do. I think there's also this, cars sort of pre-75 were, obviously a lot of them were handcrafted. And so they're very slightly, they weren't aiming for this, but they're very slightly asymmetrical. And I think there's something quite human about that. It's very easy now, with CAD, you build one side, scan it, clean it up, and then you just reflect it. And everything's like perfectly symmetrical. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter. Like, if the left-hand headlight lens is exactly the opposite of the right-hand one, because you're never going to interchange those things anyway.
You're right.
I think there's maybe something. I don't know what it is. I don't have an answer to this. This is me just speculating. But I think there's something about imperfection that's really interesting. I think I remember there's this Italian company that makes these beautiful shoes, and generations of craftspeople, and they've worked out how to make these leather shoes out of a single piece, like absolutely flawless. But before it goes out of the workshop, they nick it. They nick the leather. They just put a tiny flaw in it because it's just better. Weirdly, I don't know. There's something about that. So there's something about an imperfection. So I like a little bit of. I like a bit of frisson. I like a bit of friction. I think a bit of tension. Again, it's a bit of a cliche, but without the sand, there is no pearl.
The Lowdown Show is presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. I think, in terms of design, automotive design, the thing that really strikes me that where everything sort of went astray is the tail light. Because there was a few years ago, there was a Honda Civic, and the taillights were just, it was absurdly busy, and there were fake vents at the back. And then I was in traffic, and I saw an older Ferrari, 330 or something. I don't know them that. And it was just a round. And it's like, oh my God, it's just a taillight. It wasn't overachieving. It wasn't trying to look intergalactic or like it could shoot you to a Death Star. It literally, it was lights, brake, and a turn signal. And I just thought, oh my God, it's revolutionary.
Yeah.
How did we get so messed up? And a lot of those cars that we admire, the Mira, didn't Gandini have to use the same headlight as a 850 Fiat or something? And so it, in many ways, I think that was a blessing. It just stopped them from going nuts.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think this having to use sort of existing components is really interesting. I mean, it's kind of a pain in the ass, but I also sort of slightly perversely enjoy working on pre-existing platforms or pre-existing architecture, because it sort of forces you to make some compromises that you wouldn't, I think, if you were just designing it from the ground up. And then also, I think what it does is it introduces some different voices into the kind of conversation, because I'm inheriting this thing that is a sort of the representation of a ton of other people's decisions. And then I'm kind of, often I kind of like, I'll strip all the sort of unnecessary parts off and then just look at it and kind of, and then it's my interpretation on top of that. And, Ettore Sottsass, like, famously said, design is debate. It's a dialogue. It's not a monologue. It's kind of like, here's my take. And then, then there's a response, and then you respond to that response. And there's this sort of back and forth. I think, I think there's lots of different ways of designing. I do think, the sort of complexity of the lights, I think it sometimes to do with like inherited parts and sort of building around those. That doesn't always work, obviously. There's something, because also I think a lot of those cars were these sort of beautiful sculptural forms, and then just sort of punctuated by some sort of utilities, right? Yes. They're like, oh shit, okay, now we'll get this. And yet we'll get the cutter, we'll just cut a hole out of the bodywork.
And yet
but there's something really, see, I find I quite like the wrongness of that. I think there's something really appealing. I'm a big fan of race cars and race vehicles, because I quite like the idea that you take this sort of, you start with this beautiful sort of GTO, and then they're like, shit, we're not getting enough air to the brakes. And then, someone gets the Sawzall out and kind of, just cuts a hole in it.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's not, it's not symmetrical. It's not, it's not aligned. It's just sort of where it has to be. And there's a certain sort of tension to that. I guess there's a narrative to that starts to become quite interesting. Talking narratives, there's the classic Ducati narrative of the fiberglass fuel tanks, and they would make them out of translucent fiberglass, and they would leave an unpainted section so you could kind of see the fuel level. And there was one, they were churning these things out super quick, because I guess they were crashing them as quickly as they could make them. But one of them, there's a fly trapped in it. And now that's become a thing. Like that's a kind of in the Ducati world, that's a kind of meme, right? You can even get like a little fly sticker to kind of stick on it.
Well, let's stop talking about other people's work and let's have a look at your work. Now, this is an electric motorcycle that you made, and And before I ask you about its history, I think this is a fabulous a fabulous motorcycle. I don't think you need to preface it by the term electric. And I don't know. I've seen pictures of this thing for years, and I have no idea. I haven't even read anything that you've ever said about it intentionally, because I knew that someday I would speak to you about it. So tell me what this started as, and then how did you get here?
So I was contacted by Zero Motorcycles, who are here in California, a couple of hours south in Santa Cruz. And back in 2018, I think. So I think the first thing to remark on is this is now like a 6-year-old design. But about 7 years ago, 2018, Zero contacted me, and we'd been talking back and forth, and they said, we might have something for you. Can you come down and have a chat with us? And I thought, well, maybe there's a variation of one of their existing models. Anyway, I came down, signed half a dozen kind of NDAs and all that kind of stuff, and then got ushered into their kind of development lab, where they had the beginnings of their Zero SRF, which is the first new platform they designed for like a decade. And I was really lucky enough to be the first designer, external designer in the world to get my hands on one, pre-production. It's about 6-9 months before it came out, it was revealed to the world. And so that's the underpinnings of this bike, the XP. So it's essentially the powertrain and the frame and the swing arm of the SRF platform. I think actually the platform is called FST. And Zero were a really big fan of the Ducati Hyper Scrambler that we had done, and essentially gave us pretty much free reign. They're like, look, we just really like what you do. Can you just
go do something?
Tell us what you would do with this. And then after quite a lot of like sort of, agonizing and stuff, this is what resulted. This was 2018. So, really the sort of electric was starting to gather some real momentum. Like it was really starting to feel like this is going to be crazy cool. And so I wanted to look at designing a unique design language and then unapologetically electric design language for Zero. So I wanted a motor. It's intentionally only semi-fared because I wanted to keep the technology exposed, not hide it away. And look at, could we take a kind of fresh look at motorcycle design, and what would electric design language look like? And part of the way we did that was to almost roll kind of history backwards to the 1900s and kind of and sort of posit, like, what would it be like if we'd only had electric motorcycles? What would a 2020 motorcycle look like? What decisions would have been made in the intervening decades, the intervening century? Where would we be now? And that sounds a slightly extraordinary claim, but actually we were so close to that. Like in 1900, there were twice as many electric vehicles on the road as gas vehicles. Around 1914, 1915, Thomas Edison and Henry Ford were going to start an electric car company. They even prototyped one on a Model T chassis. And weirdly, ironically, the thing that probably killed the electric car was the electric starter motor that suddenly made gas cars make sense. I know, it's a horrible irony.
That's great. Yeah.
It really is, actually. It's almost like if we could have held off the starter motor for like 5 or 10 years, we really may be living. We could very much be living in a reality where vehicles had always been electric.
Let's take a short break for a few words from our sponsor. Picture this: you're in the garage, your favorite room in the house, and you're tuning up your engine with parts that you found on eBay. Every piece is just locking perfectly into place. You step back to admire your work, hands covered in grease, and because you're committed to riding that thing further than the odometer can even handle, you start thinking to yourself, you know what, I could probably also use some new brakes, maybe a shock. This baby, well, it deserves a new air filter. So you head straight back to eBay. You can find any part you need there. It's unreal. From headlights to air filters to exhaust systems, all the way to those carbon fiber rims you've fancied. eBay is the stocked garage of your dreams. And you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit, because eBay knows DIY fixes can be major and mods are always intense. So you need to know those parts are guaranteed to fit every time before you dive in. Wrench first. And on the off chance you order a part and it doesn't fit, we'll send it back. Simple as that. You know what you love more than your bike itself, and that is, of course, riding it. You're serious when it comes to engine maintenance and locked in when you're headed into a build. And that's exactly why you start with eBay, minor fixer, complete overhaul. You want to get your ride back on the road, and you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit. So eBay created My Garage, where all you have to do is add your ride's info to get the exact parts that fit. When you see that green check, you're a click away from that part clicking perfectly into place. Well, now that you know all of this, just imagine standing at that open garage door, looking at the bike you love more than anything, knowing that anything is possible, whether it's keeping it on the road forever or turning it into something that's never been on the road before. Because with eBay, your garage just got a whole lot bigger. Get all the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Now back to my conversation with Hugo Eccles. The Lowdown Show is presented by adbrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. You talked about something that I think that I've often thought of, which is that with a motorcycle, that so much of it is visual. The propulsion system is visual, unlike a car, unlike virtually anything. You can't see the furnace in my house. So much of the mechanisms, the wiring is contained within the walls. But a motorcycle is a very peculiar device because its propulsion system is its aesthetic. And so here's what I wonder. Is there a separate, distinct design language that's necessary for an electric motorcycle?
I think so. Yeah, I think that there could and there should be. I think what's quite interesting about doing this sort of alternate reality approach, or these almost sort of parallel present, depending on how you want to term it. I think if you sort of go back to the 1900s and you kind of say, okay, like what if I had never ever seen a gas motorcycle? Like, how would I design a motorcycle? And I just think we would have made some very different decisions in the intervening kind of century. And I think that's actually, I found that to be a really powerful tool because it kind of allows us to sort of get out of the way. It's not an easy thing to do. It's quite difficult to kind of remind yourself, no, hang on a second, I wouldn't have that expectation because I've never seen a gas bike, or no, that's not a form I would recognize because it would never have existed. So there's something quite interesting about that. I think I totally understand why current electric motorcycle companies mimic gas bikes. I totally understand it. It's a familiarity. It's a known entity. Motorcycle designers are very comfortable with designing motorcycles. I think some of the challenges, if you're trying to design gas motorcycles and electric motorcycles, everyone's drawing from the same pool. It gets weird and confused. I do think I think if you make an electric motorcycle look like a gas motorcycle, I don't think it allows you to kind of celebrate the differences. They are very different vehicles, a gas bike and an electric bike. They just handle very differently. You ride them in a different way. Your experience is very different. I think if you make them look like a gas bike, people just think, and because you're sort of encouraging them to think this, that it's basically just like a gas bike with a different motor in it. But the implications are not, and then they miss out on the implications. I think it's almost a bit like kind of comparing a landline to an iPhone. Sure, they both make phone calls, but the implications of those things are very different. The implications of the sort of intelligence and the electronics, and obviously it just gets better and better with electric. It's very, very different. I mean, for example, there's this, one thing that's really interesting on a physical level is, unlike a gas bike, the weight doesn't change. So this XP is, I think it's about 280 pounds, which, to put it into context, is, I think it might be a pound less or a pound more than the wet weight of a 998. But it makes twice the torque. But what's interesting is the weight never changes. So you can totally dial the suspension. You don't have this situation where full of gas, it weighs 40 pounds more, and empty of gas, it weighs
It's quite fun. I never thought of that because
the center of gravity shifts, you know what I mean? And then so what do? You pick you half fill it, and then that's where you dial the suspension. Yeah, so I mean, there's some really interesting implications of that. Also, there are no gears, but also that means you, in a way, because you have no gears, you also have every gear. So I can dive into a corner, and I do not have to worry about what gear I am in, because if I dive into a corner and suddenly I realize it's a switchback, and I'm like, oh, holy shit. On a gas bike, this becomes quite interesting, right? You're kind of braking.
The man stabbing at the lever.
You're trying to sort of feather the clutch back in. try not to unstick it. It all gets quite sexy quite quickly, you know. But so because I don't have to worry about the gear, I can brake much later into a corner. I can sweep around, and I have all this torque on tap from like almost zero revs upward. You know, it's pretty much a flat line. So it just handles very differently. So there's something about that as well. And then also because there's slightly less cognitive load about the gearing, I find myself, I can kind of transfer that attention to road positioning and smoothness, and you know that old racing adage that, you know, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. You're really rocking and rolling, but it's just such a different thing. And I think so. And going back to the sort of original question again, I think if you make it look like a gas bike, all you're also doing is you're obviously drawing comparisons. And you're kind of making them look the same, but obviously the electric bike that looks like a gas bike is a lesser proposition than the kind of full fat version. So it sets up this weird comparison that I think we just shouldn't be having that conversation. They're just very different things. So but it's difficult to do, I think. You know, I think there's a real challenge designing motorcycles. Like I said, everyone's kind of drawing from the same, you know, the same sort of pool of reference and the same history. And I do think there's somewhat of this problem of, you know, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so when you give a project to a motorcycle designer or a gas motorcycle designer, surprise, surprise, you end up with a gas motorcycle design.
Electrification, as you know, is not just a propulsion system. It has become politicized, where a lot of people just are totally dismissive, and they feel that there's a government plots and government mandates, and there's a lot of cloak and dagger and conspiracy theories that surround it. It's not just a different propulsion system. It's far more than that. And because there's so much machismo in motorcycling, which surrounds anything that men dominate, there's this idea that you know, we've learned how to match revs and downshift and all these things, and I have this skill set as an experienced motorcyclist, and God damn it, if I want to give that away to one lever, the twist and go thing, you know, as a scooter would be, which we think of that derisively. So how do these things all play into it? And I almost feel sorry for the electric motorcycle because it gets blamed for everything, where really it's just what it is, and it's new, and it's still finding its feet, and it's like a baby rabbit, many of which I have in my yard, that it keeps getting clubbed by someone who says you're not a full grown rabbit. It's a really bad analogy, but you know where I'm going with this.
I know what you mean. Yeah,
I totally get it. It's as if we're killing it before we even give it a chance to live.
I mean, well, I think again, you know, see, I think not to kind of beat a dead horse, but I think some of this stems from trying to make electric bikes look like gas bikes. Like it's a that inadvertently turns it into an or conversation versus an and conversation. I think the solution to it is just an and conversation. I have both. I love both. I use the Hyper Scrambler as a daily ride. There's something just so fun about the engine and everything, and doing a lot of complex things simultaneously, you know, sort of changing lane while, you know, canceling the blinker and, you know, putting a bit of brake and feathering the clutch and doing a ton of shit, or, you know, while sort of looking over shoulder, but not, you know, I mean, there's something super satisfying about that. Electric's just a very different thing. They really are night and day experiences. So I think it's an and conversation. Like we can have both. They're both very good at different things. There's something about, and you know, actually one of the biggest challenges of the electric industry is just getting people to ride them, because once they ride them, they are like, where do I sign? Because there's something about pulling out, punching this thing. I don't have to worry about the gears. I have, like I said, I think it's like 140 foot-pounds or something, like on tap. It's like mental. Bang, it's done. It is like literally riding a little rocket or something. I mean, and I'm not having to change down a gear and sort of pick my moment. I can literally just sort of do it. But I think, so there's that. And then, there's this very strange, people have this very strange reaction to electric. And I think it's almost like a homophobia. It's kind of like, I can't even entertain the idea of electric, because I might get turned electric, and then I'm going to get.
Next thing you know, you're wearing nylons and heels,
and then I'm going to get ostracized by all my friends.
It's a whole
you know what I mean?
lifestyle.
I'm going to be outed or something. I don't know. There's something. It's a kind of there's almost a fear of it, which is so strange. And like I said, I think it's an and conversation. They are both great at very different things.
But how do we deal with the notion, because the sound of an engine, the feel of an engine, for all brands, but particularly, I'm thinking of, say, Ducati and Harley Davidson. There's two brands, that the sound and the feel and the mechanicalness of them is the motorcycle as well as the way it looks. I mean, I mean, Harley, there was that famous case where they tried to actually patent the sound of their engine a number of years ago. So how does that play into it? And because we view electric propulsion systems as sort of ubiquitous. There's not it's not a V12 electric, or it's not a single electric, or it's just sort of, we don't, and a lot of this, I think, is upon us because we're unfamiliar with them. Is we just view it as just like the washing machine. So how do those brands retain an identity that makes sense to previous owners, or do you just break off, and how does that? How do you deal with that?
Oh, I totally. I mean, that raises. I think for me, that raises a ton of. There are a number of answers to that. I think one is there seems to be a tendency for a lot of electric vehicles to be kind of designed almost like consumer electronics, like you say, like a washing machine or an iPhone or something. I think what I try to do is imbue, we did it with the XP, and we're working with Harley Davidson Livewire at the moment, is try to retain or draw out or imbue the electric motorcycle with as much mechanicalness as we can. Like, really celebrate it. We can't create the noise of the roar of a combustion engine, but there's still a real joy in, like, sort of intricately designed and engineered things moving together, or very tiny little kind of interference gaps and things like sliding past each other, and colors of things. There's such a, when you go to a car show, I mean, there's such a richness of sort of color, materials, finishes, and other details that we can include. So there's that. I mean, talking of Livewire, I think we haven't had to do it because, again, it hasn't really been a thing yet, but electric vehicles are relatively quiet. They're not actually as quiet as everyone thinks they are, especially motorcycles. Motorcycles actually make quite a loud whine, almost like a kind of Star Wars TIE fighter. That's actually quite a cool noise, or like a supercharger or something, because they're not shielded in the same way that a car is, because a car is all about the cockpit being silent and all that. But a motorcycle is much more sort of like you're in it. So you really do hear the motor. Some run chains, but they're quite weird. You can really hear the clickety-clack of the chain. It's not a great noise. But Livewire, for example, but I think you could really go much further with this. They have a gearbox. They have a gearbox on their Livewire, Harley Davidson Livewire, but they very intentionally used straight cut gears. because they make a certain noise, a certain whine that
Oh, I didn't know that.
different gearing doesn't make, because a lot of transmission gearing has been designed for cars to be quiet, right? So I think and then when we were doing the XP, we didn't actually get to manifest any of this, but we were starting to look at some surface structures that work with radar and LiDAR to make the motorcycle appear very large to those computer systems. So that's a safety issue. But we were also looking at whether we could perforate the body panels so that at certain speeds it would generate noises. So, I mean, I think there's this whole world of opportunity. And I think what's really interesting about being an industrial designer is a lot of my job, when we work for companies like Hewlett-Packard or, American Express and stuff, is we're going out in the world and we're pulling lots of different solutions from lots of different categories and industries and kind of going, this problem you have is actually very similar to something we encountered when we were working in the medical industry, and we can pull that in. And that really reminds us of when we were working, in telecoms, and we can pull that in. And so there's something really interesting about that as well. I think there's something really powerful about industrial design, because we're so unlike vehicle design, we're kind of in every category. And so we know about a lot of things that no one in their right mind would go, I'm designing a motorcycle, I'm going to go research medical products, I mean, to draw a somewhat analogy, and it does have an automotive angle to it. I don't know if did you ever hear that story about medical crash teams training with Formula One pit crews?
No.
Crash teams, obviously, there's a ton of people around someone who's in a critical state, and everything has to happen very fast and very accurately and instantaneously. And someone had the genius idea, some doctor thought, pit lane teams, we should go talk to them about how we do it and how they do it, and see where their overlap is, and what can we learn from them, or what can they learn from us. And so they trained with some Formula One pit teams to go, how do you service a car in 9 seconds, because it's actually very similar to an ICU crash team. So, I mean, the ability to do this sort of lateral thinking and pull the sort of unrelated things into this kind of category is really interesting. So I think there's that. And like I said, I try to really imbue, there's such a rich history and legacy of just fantastic materials and finishes and just mechanical stuff. I think sometimes, like I said, they get designed like consumer electronics, and really consumer electronics are designed a bit like cars to kind of hide all the mechanics and just be this sort of sleeky thing. And yeah, motorcycles they're almost like a kind of transparent product, aren't they? You actually get to see all the workings. I suppose it's to draw a product design analogy, when the first iMac came out, they knew it was going to be transparent or translucent. And so they designed all the circuit boards, and they designed all the ribbing inside of the plastic forms that you never normally see. I mean, everything. And I think also there's this idea.
Although that wasn't an idea that ultimately had legs, was it? Because that's sort of been abandoned, hasn't it?
Well, it got abandoned after about a decade. I mean, I think it got abandoned somewhat because actually that iMac aesthetic, that sort of translucency, was so successful that you couldn't shake a stick without hitting something that was.
Remember there was a Buell. There was a Buell
translucent. Yeah, I love that Buell. XB. But see, that Buell, actually, Eric Buell, I would argue not necessarily a great designer, but amazing engineer. That Buell, incredible. I mean, see, that's some proper lateral thinking. They put the fuel in the frame, The oil sump was in the swing arm. It had the rear shock was underneath the engine with the exhaust. It was all about lowering the center of gravity. That bike was super, super clever.
The Lowdown Show is presented by adbrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. Here's a question related to design, and we're going to step away from electrics for a moment, but the whole notion of and I don't know if, again, this is a CAD issue, or I don't know if this is a where we are in history, but there's a lot of motorcycles, a lot of design, back to the Honda Civic taillights. A lot of design is just, it seems that no surface shall go untouched. And I think back to, we had a Triumph Scrambler, a modern retro Triumph Scrambler, and there was a heat shield in the exhaust pipe, and there was a screen, and there were slats that went this way, and there were slats that went that way, and it was beveled here and a different radius there, and then I looked, out of curiosity, I went back and looked up an old photograph of like a high pipe TR6 or something from the 60s. It was just a little chrome thing. And I thought, well, does it need to be that complicated? And of course it doesn't. It's when you start designing things that are supposed to do a specific task, and you start designing them for their aesthetic purpose. Now, I realize I'm oversimplifying because there's a lot of overlap. Because I mean, I think of I think the most beautiful motorcycles, which is Harley Davidson's XR750 flat tracker, which is beautiful, and yet it's such a utilitarian tool in a sense. So, I mean, there's a bike that, was it designed? Well, of course, somebody had to decide the shape of the cylinder, but was it designed for aesthetics or just for cooling? And again, your fascination with race vehicles. That's why I think MotoGP motorcycles are not beautiful in the traditional sense, but beautiful in that I just love that there's all that stuff going on there. I mean, there's just really dense and fascinating.
Yes.
Totally. That was a long intro and not much of a question.
I know. Well, there were a few in there. I was trying to keep track.
Why is everything so busy? That's my point. Why is everything so busy?
So Robert Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which I read years and years ago, and actually had a profound effect on me. He introduced me, and I don't know if it was his idea originally, but he introduced me to the idea that there are two sorts of beauty. There's aesthetic beauty and there's intellectual beauty. And so I think aesthetic beauty is beauty that we all recognize and we're very familiar with. But then intellectual beauty is this idea of, I guess on a very basic level, sort of cleverness, where you're just like, oh, that's super smart. I mean, E = MC squared, the fact that you can boil like reality down to like five characters is, I mean, the beauty of that is, I mean, it's kind of incredible, isn't it, really? And I think there's, like you say, there's those GP bikes, everything has a functionality. They're not really designed. I mean, because if it doesn't work, if it's pretty but it doesn't work, it's out. That's prettiness is very low on the kind of scale of stuff. But, it also reminds me of, there's this sort of Buckminster Fuller quote that, when he said, when I'm designing, I don't consider beauty, but when I'm finished, if it's not beautiful, I know it's wrong. Because I think when you get it right, it sort of fits together, you know what I mean? And there's something you kind of recognize about that. So I think, the race bikes, are fascinating, and I think that's also what's, for me, it's really interesting about designing motorcycles is aesthetics are a part of it, but it's this challenge of merging and marrying the aesthetics with the functionality, and ideally not compromising either, which is actually very difficult to do. And because there's, like you said earlier, like the motorcycle's very exposed, and I think. And again, back to an earlier point as well, I think there's a real beauty, a different sort of beauty in the mechanical stuff, right? And I think sometimes designers, they're very frightened of that, and then they just sort of cover it up. They put a sort of sleeky body over the top of it. Whereas I really think, if you did some there's just some beautiful machining, and just there's something really, really satisfying on a different level with sort of mechanical things. And I don't think that, you know, electrics sort of avoid that. And then to the earlier sort of the other point you made about overcomplicating everything, I think sometimes that results from, like, the heat shield. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect the heat shield, being a relatively minor part, was probably given to like an intern or a junior designer who then thought, this is my
I'm
moment
going to make my name.
This is my moment to shine.
Right,
you know what I
right.
mean? And it's like, to use a sort of a movie analogy, like, not everyone can be the star, right? Like, and not everyone has to be the star. Like, there are bit players and crowd scenes, and, you know, and it's like you said, like, that doesn't need to be a thing. Also, like, the fact that it has a heat shield that's not remarkable, and it shouldn't be visually remarkable. It's just like, it's a thing. It just keeps the heat off your leg. It doesn't need to be this over designed thing. I mean, I spent a lot of my time, I spent a ton of time trying to not design things. And I know that sounds really strange coming from a designer, but
you can't unknow what you know. Isn't that part
no?
of the
Well,
challenge?
that's the game you play with yourself.
Right,
but
right.
but trying to, to draw a sort of acting analogy, to, like, sort of almost hone it to a point where it has this sort of, it's so inevitable, it's so sort of natural that it should be that you don't really see the hand of the designer anymore. It's not me kind of imposing my will on the world. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, there's some, you know, really great industrial designers. Like, there's a British one called Jasper Morrison, and then there's a Japanese one, Naota Fukusawa, who are very into these things called supernormal design. But, like, when you design a chair, you're designing the most chairy chair. You know what I mean? It's almost like super generic, which is sort of interesting. Like, it's the most handlebar, or the you know, just, well, yeah, sort of. What's quite strange is, actually, unremarkable things are quite rare nowadays, in a way.
Well, I've got you here, and before I let you go, I want to talk about get your thoughts on retro motorcycles. And first, I'm going to give you mine, and then we'll see where we agree and diverge. But if you think about it in car terms, because sometimes you need this analogy just to be able to look at something anew. So if I go into a Ford dealership, I can't buy a 1956 or something that looks like a 1956 Thunderbird. Lovely car. And then something that looks like a Mach-E Mustang, the electric Mustang. And just think about that, or a Ferrari dealer. You can't go in and get a, something that would have raced in the, Mille Miglia or whatever they call it in Italy in the 40s. And yet you go into a motorcycle shop, specifically Triumph, and, they have an Evel Knievel replica Rocket 3. I was in a shop recently. There's an Elvis Presley Bonneville. I'm not sure anyone knows who those people are anymore, other than people of my age. But is there something? Why are we drawn to these old motorcycles? And here's my question to you: is there something in that flat tank, flat seat that is just so right that diverging from that just somehow seems, we perceive it as wrong? And maybe a musical analogy, say the Western scale of music versus the music scale that you'll hear in India or Eastern Asia. Is there something that just sounds right or feels right about that kind of motorcycle? Why do we keep going back to it?
I mean, I think the Triumphs are referencing a kind of point that you were referencing, where, like, stuff wasn't over designed, and it was, I think there were a lot of kind of, like, just very functional decisions made. I mean, it does bother me a bit. I mean, I would somewhat not disagree, but I would say you can go into a Ford dealership and buy a Bronco. So,
you're right. Yeah, okay. You blew that one out of the water.
Or you could buy a Volkswagen people. But
It's true.
I don't know. I mean, it does worry me a bit. I think there's a sort of dearth of new ideas. I think I was thinking about this the other day. It's kind of like, where's our optimism? Like, it was in the, in the 60s and the 50s, it was like everything, what a amazing sort of period of new forms, and like people just really excited about the space age and like aerodynamics and fins and stuff. And I don't know. Yeah, I think there's something quite troubling about sort of going backwards. I mean, I do think in times of sort of economic instability, people do tend to revert, right? Because it's sort of reassuring and it's familiar, and there's a reassurance in that. I think in maybe more stable times, I think then you get people kind of pushing the boundaries. Somewhat related, I'm always struck by the fact that there's only 5 years between the Lamborghini Miura and the Lamborghini Countach in design terms. I mean, just amazing. I mean, obviously one is very much the kind of swan song of that. The Miura was very much the swan song of that kind of aesthetic. And then, I mean, even now you see a LP 500, LP 400.
400, yeah.
They just blow your mind. And I can only imagine what that impact must have been like in 1972 or 1971 when they first revealed it. I mean, just even now they're incredible. So there's something about that. Again, I think this idea of almost kind of going backwards and recasting history may be a way of sort of reconciling those two slightly competing kind of imperatives, where we want some history is great. We love history. We love narratives. We love stories. Heritage is important for brands, and people do respond to that, and it really resonates with them. But then I agree, there's a point where it goes a bit too far, and then it's just a pastiche. I would say a lot of the Triumphs are pastiches, aren't they?
Yes.
I think what was quite interesting is you compare, say, that Triumph, whatever, Thruxton or something, to when Ducati did the Sport 1000. And I think that was actually really interesting, because that was kind of a modern take on an old typology. And actually, I think it had that quite nice, the Sport 1000, Sport Classic had that sort of modern classic balance I think they navigated that quite well, I think.
Although there was a lot of, I take your point. There were elements of that bike that I thought worked exceptionally well.
Yeah.
The tank and the engine itself were beautiful. Mind you, you could have stood a cat in the top of the rear wheel and it wouldn't have touched the fender. Yeah. So I think incorporating modern wide 17-inch wheels into a design that would have had skinny 18 or 19-inch wheels, it wasn't entirely successful. But have we lost our optimism? And I love, well, as you can probably guess, I love mid-century modern design. And yet we're not living in modern houses. I mean, the typical house today is a sort of a faux Victorian mansion with gables and dormers and 14 different roof lines, and it's very different than what we were promised as the 50s began, aren't we? We've really gone 50s, back.
Yeah, I mean, the 50s are really interesting, because the 50s are actually kind of the 20s delayed, right? Because the 20s were like such an interesting era, weren't they? I mean, the 20s were like the dawn of the kind of modern age as we know it. Jazz, aircraft, radio, skyscrapers, and then obviously there was a bit of kerfuffle in the middle, and then that sort of settled down in the 1950s. I think I had a really great point I was going to make, and I've kind of it was really good.
That's what happens when you drink first thing in the morning. You just can't hold on.
Yeah.
You just can't hold on to these thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, too many Irish coffees. The optimism. Yeah, I think So what's really interesting about us doing this sort of alternate reality stuff is I'm going to have to use my hands to kind of demonstrate a thing. So we have our kind of like our existing reality that we know. Let's say a straight line from the past to the present onto the future. There's this alternate reality that we were, like I mentioned, like we were really, really close to having. I mean,
and you're
millimeters away
speaking
from it.
again at the point at which, you know, actually there were three propulsion systems. There was steam, electricity, and gasoline all sort of vying for prominence. And
but this idea, like we were very, I mean, there were electric trams, electric cars, especially in cities and stuff. So like if you almost take that, like we'd sort of diverge very slightly. And actually what's quite interesting is sort of like around 2020, I think that reality started bending towards ours. And I think we're at this junction point where we can keep going this way and we kind of know how that's going to turn out. And it's not super positive. Or we can kind of jump trains and we can go off in this other direction, which I think has a lot more hope and a lot more optimism. And so maybe that's part of it as well. And again, you see, this is the thing about making, when you tether this new propulsion technology, first new propulsion technology, not totally, but you know what I mean, for a century, to this old vocabulary, this old gas bike vocabulary, you're kind of tethering it to all the baggage as well. And it's like, you probably shouldn't do that. I mean, the other thing that we kind of, you know, is not naming any names, but a few of those heritage brands have some very questionable values that do not align with the new generation and the new audiences that you're trying to attract into motorcycling. You know, because it can't just be 55-year-old white blokes, right? Like we need to expand the appeal. But there's a lot of there's certain companies that I probably don't need to mention, but like whose values are almost the antithesis of the values of those audiences they are trying to attract.
Let's wrap things up with a few words from our sponsor. Picture this, you're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. Well, it's okay because you know whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got everything. Brake rotors, lights, and tire exhaust systems, whatever you need. And it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers and hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.